Author and historian Max Boot joins us now after publishing this recent book about the former President Ronald Reagan. It's a pleasure to have you with us. First of all, do you have a sense of what Ronald Reagan would have thought about the election results in 2024?
Gosh, really hard to say, but I think it's fair to say that he was a very different kind of Republican than Donald Trump. I mean, remember Reagan was somebody who was pro-immigration, pro-free trade, pro-NATO, pro-standing up to Russian aggression, and he was somebody who had a very sunny, optimistic vision of the country and tried to bring people together rather than divide them. I mean, of course, he was also a loyal Republican for many decades, and I'm sure he would always be happy to see the Republican Party winning elections, but I suspect he would be very puzzled and troubled by the current configuration of the Republican Party, which is so different from the one that he led.
If there was one Reagan principle that Donald Trump violated more than any other, it might have been his 11th commandment.
Yes, Reagan often said, "Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican." And of course, Trump does that all the time, trashing Mitch McConnell or Nikki Haley or others who have criticized him from within the Republican Party. So he clearly does not feel the same loyalty to the Republican Party that the Republican loyalty shows to him. And that's, I think, very different from Reagan.
It might be hard to do, given that the facts on the ground are very different in Russia now than they were in the 1980s. But do you see a significant and concrete shift in the Republican Party's stance? You mentioned NATO, and with the Ukrainian conflict now, how would Ronald Reagan have felt about this openness the Trump administration has voiced toward perhaps negotiating some settlement with Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
Well, that's an easy one. There are a lot of issues where it's hard to imagine what Reagan would think about today's world. But on the issue of standing up to Russian aggression, I have no doubt that he would be foursquare behind the Ukrainians, just as he stood behind the Poles and the Afghans and so many others in the 1980s. In fact, his Reagan doctrine was helping anti-communist forces to battle Soviet oppression. And this is no longer the Soviet Union, of course, now it's Russia, but it's pretty much the same thing. And I'm sure that he would be completely behind sending aid to Ukraine and would be very troubled to see the current Republic, so many people in the current Republican Party opposing that aid.
You interviewed countless people close to Ronald Reagan and documented a lot of his life in such a thorough fashion. You already mentioned his preference toward NATO, his stance on immigration, seeing increased immigration as a sign of American strength, its invitation to people to come here and enjoy liberty and freedom in America. You mentioned a number of positions there. Also, one I would add, after he left the White House, his stance on embracing a ban on assault weapons or some increased regulation on guns. None of those are center to the Republican Party today. Evaluate how stark or how true a statement like this is. The party of Reagan is dead.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I think you can see some continuities from Reagan's party to Trump's party, including the fact that Reagan was also interested in appointing conservative judges and cutting taxes. So that there's certainly some continuities, but I think the differences are much greater and starker than the similarities. And again, it's impossible to imagine a current Republican president signing a bill as Reagan did that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants, as you just mentioned, or supporting an assault weapons ban, which Reagan also did. So yeah, I think that Reagan did exert a lot of influence on U.S. politics for decades after his leaving office. But now there are not many traces of his Republican Party anymore, and clearly his influence has been vastly eclipsed by that of Donald Trump.
Can I tell you a quick story? We were recently interviewing Jack Danforth, the former senator from here in Missouri. Of course, you wrote about how he helped to eulogize Ronald Reagan and was the minister overseeing his funeral.
Right.
He was also the first special counsel appointed ever in America, and his appointment was to investigate Waco, the place where Donald Trump would later launch his 2024 re-election campaign. He also helped shepherd Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court and wrote to Clarence Thomas and the other justices and urged them not to grant a president total immunity. In looking at that case and that question, Clarence Thomas left a footnote at the bottom of one of his dissent opinions in which Clarence Thomas wrote that a special counsel itself is entirely unconstitutional and should not exist, does not have legal authority. Jack Danforth sort of chuckled to me and said, "My old friend has erased me." Just how true is that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of truth to that. I can't imagine, a lot of Reagan-Bush Republicans going where the current Republican Party has wound up. Although some of them have evolved with that party, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were certainly shocked by the Supreme Court decision, which seemingly grants the president immunity from prosecution for quote unquote official acts, which is just about anything he does when in office. And I think that's certainly antithetical to the traditional conservative understanding of checks and balances and the need for judicial restraint on the exercise of executive authority, and that seems to be certainly waning in today's Republican Party. So I'm sure that Senator Danforth, for one, does not recognize what the party has become.
Max, I can think of at least one Trump-Vance policy proposal that maybe former President Reagan would have liked, this idea of making it a lot easier to fire federal employees.
Yeah, that's true. Reagan was definitely never a fan of the federal government, even when he led it. And that was one of the ironies, is that even when he was the president, he still acted as if he were this outside critic of the federal government. And unfortunately, I think one of the consequences of that was that there were a lot of scandals that developed on his watch because he wasn't paying close enough attention to what was actually being done by people that he had appointed. But I don't think even Ronald Reagan ever went as far as what President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Vance have suggested, which is basically, eliminating the civil service and getting rid en masse of the apolitical federal employees. I mean, Reagan certainly, expressed dismay at the way the federal bureaucracy works and wanted to make it more efficient, but I don't think he was intent on politicizing it to the extent that I think is the Trump-Vance intent today.
Max, we journalists are often tasked with writing that first draft of history, and sometimes amid our stutters and stammers and knee-jerk reactions to try and get it right, we make mistakes. We leave it to smarter people like you, authors and historians, to synthesize all that and give us the final draft of history. Is it too soon to say yet how history will reflect back on this sea change, Donald Trump's ascent to the GOP and its shift within the party?
Oh, yeah, no, I think it's way too soon to pass any judgment on what Trump means or how history will reflect upon it, because obviously he's just, hasn't even started his second term, so we have no idea what he's going to do. I think it takes decades after a president leaves office to pass any kind of judgment based on historical hindsight with any kind of objectivity. And I think that's something I've been able to do with my Reagan book, Reagan, His Life and Legend. But that's, on Ronald Reagan's presidency, which was in the 1980s, which was, of course, many decades ago. And I think it will take another 30 years at least to pass that kind of objective judgment on the Trump presidency.
And a lot of people that pick up your book and thumb through the foreword of it and some of the acknowledgments will find that many people close to Ronald Reagan had very high praise for how you captured his life, his spirit, and his work. Were there things in your work as you were penning this book that surprised you, things you discovered that you didn't expect to find about Ronald Reagan?
I think one of the big things that I found was that he was much more pragmatic than people realized, and we've been talking about some of that already, but he was somebody who was remembered as kind of a conservative ideologue, somebody who animated the Republican base. And yet, once he was in office, he often pivoted to the center, as he did, beginning in his term as governor of California in 1967, when he immediately, signed a budget that greatly raised taxes and spending in order to deal with California's fiscal situation. And then he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country. And, made deals with Jesse Unruh, the Democratic Speaker of the California Assembly, just as he later made deals with Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was not somebody who believed that you can govern from an ideologically pure perspective. He always said, he'd rather get 80% of what he wanted rather than go over the cliff with his flags flying, as he said so many conservatives want to do. And so he was actually, I think, much more moderate and pragmatic in office than people realize. And I think the ultimate expression of that was in his second term as president, when he struck up a friendship and worked so constructively with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, to peacefully end the Cold War and to reduce the levels of nuclear armaments. That's not something anybody expected from this hardline conservative who had been, preaching about the evils of communism for decades. And yet Reagan was able to see that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader, somebody that he could do business with, even though a lot of people on the right were skeptical. Reagan was convinced. And I think that's a historical gamble that paid off and ultimately is a tribute to Reagan's own pragmatism and moderation, and that he was willing to transcend ideology to get things done. And that's, I think, in the end, why he will be remembered as a great president.
And those stories are so well told within the pages of that book you wrote. Thank you for joining us to help break down some of it. Max Boot from New York, thanks again.
Really appreciate being on. Thank you.